So both the left and the right tend to assume that technological innovation is simply a function of the inherent potential of science and technology, but that is not the case at all. Technological innovation is actually called forth in response to the continuous struggle between competing capitalists and between capital and other classes, as all of these different groups and these different capitalists strive to gain a larger control over both the labor process and the share of the market. So as a result of this, scientific effort tends to be directed towards the needs and ends of industry instead of those of a general society. And as Kloppenberg notes, it's this specific characteristic whereby scientific invention and innovation became so closely linked to business that distinguishes the current era from those of prior. Whereas science used to be a form of generalized social property separate from or on the margins of production processes, today it is private capitalist property and has a place at the center of production processes, which leads us to, make this slight amendment to this slide that technological dynamism as it exists is for a large part capitalist dynamism, at least in the US. And this is all required so that capitalist production can maintain this is Kloppenberg's words, the momentum of accumulation. So if capitalists have to continue to accumulate more and more because if they don't expand, basically their enterprise is going to fail. So you need these constant innovations, these constant new markets, new kind of lines of accumulation to be opened up to survive in a capitalist economy, which is how these things become so linked. And to me, this is just a great example of this famous line, all that is solid melts into air, and that's what the art is. Because of these structural forces, because of the emphasis on competition, what you get is nothing remains stable and everything, melts into air, for lack of a better phrase. So I want to talk about what this shows, I think, at least to me, and this is what Kloppenberg says, is that the history of capitalist development leads to increasing commodification. It is the same. What characterizes the history of capitalist development? Two things: increasing commodification and primitive accumulation. In other words, through the imposition of the commodity form onto new geographic areas, spheres of life, and public goods, you get accumulation via the production of surplus value through the exploitation of the worker. And if you haven't come across surplus value yet, I thought it was important that we at least become somewhat familiar with it. This is a great illustration. If I'm a laborer in a factory, I work 8 hours. But within the first 2 of those 8 hours, or whatever it is, if in the first 2 of those 8 hours, I actually produce enough value to feed myself, clothe myself, to reproduce myself as a laborer, that's all I will be paid, and the rest will be collected by the capitalist as surplus value. So hopefully this schematic makes sense, and if we have questions, we can always go back to it. So that's accumulation, but what about primitive accumulation? These processes are fairly closely linked. Primitive accumulation is best defined as the separation of producers from the means of production. We covered this last week in work, with the infamous example being English enclosure and the forcing of peasants off the land. What we've observed in the history of capitalist development is a series of primitive accumulations, so these separations, followed by phases of accumulation. So primitive accumulation is historically and necessarily prior to accumulation, which separates producer from means of production. And this travels all across the globe, not only, well, I'll get to that, I guess. And there's this quote from Marx, which Kloppenberg uses to really illustrate the violence of primitive accumulation. You take my house when you do take the prop that doth sustain my house. You take my life when you do take the means whereby I live. But it's important to remember that it's not just capitalists, but all of this is backed by the state. The state backs the forms of property that require, that the forms of property required for primitive accumulation to take place. If the English government would not have supported the property claims of the pastoralists, they would not have been able to force the peasants off their land. So this is a major form of state violence. At least that's what I wanted to argue here. And primitive accumulations are central to the capitalist dynamic because they provide new avenues for accumulation, and they satisfy the needs of profit generation by bringing about like larger markets and also increased labor forces. So because capitalism, like I said, requires accumulation to sustain itself, it actually leads to the search for new markets in the form of imperialism. So this is quite literally going to other nations that were not previously capitalists and, you know, imposing the commodity form on the production there. And then what I've termed and others have termed the colonization of everyday life, where certain aspects of life in capitalist societies that were previously not commodified become commodified. And an example of this, is the seed, is, many different things that we run into repeatedly. But the seed is the main one we're talking about in this course. Let me see. Yeah, data to metadata. When primitive accumulation can't smoothly take effect, capital actually establishes a hegemony of exchange value over value, which then binds the producers to capitalist imperatives. In other words, if capitalism can't institute a regime of property in a previously non-capitalist area, whereby they would be able to then, all production processes would be converted to commodity production. If that legal hack, as work terms it, is not possible, then capital does things like they buy products from, they'll buy products from the petty commodity producers. They'll try to sell them different goods, and all of these different ways where capital works its way into what in the terms that Kloppenberg's used would be underutilized markets. So it's important because sometimes you can't immediately take over the production process, which we'll see when we talk about agriculture. And it's important to note that this isn't due to the greed of the capitalists, but to the imperatives and constraints of the capitalist social formation, or what Marx termed the silent compulsion of economic relations, or what Moishe Postone, the love of my life, just kidding, would term abstract domination, whereby it's the structures, it's these imperatives that operate above and beyond, individuals making decisions in a state of absolute freedom that doesn't exist. So how, the HE double hockey sticks, does this apply to agriculture or seeds? Great question. Follow Yoda Marx to the promised land. I swear this is taken directly from the movie. I'm sorry if my sense of humor is stupid to you. But I think, Kloppenberg presents himself, especially, as we see him here, as something of a Yoda Marx in relation to thinking about primitive accumulation and seeds. And we'll listen to him. This is from 2021.
That the big companies are doing. And what you do when you only got and see what you lose with public science, you lose the capacity to generate alternatives. I'm actually not against genetic engineering. I'm not opposed to the tools. I oppose the release of genetically modified organisms. Yes, for a variety of reasons. I oppose but what I'm worried about who uses the tool, and that they're the only ones using the tool, and they get to use the tool for what they want to do, which is nothing more than reinforcing an unsustainable agriculture, a chemical intensive, concentrated, resource intensive, technology intensive mode of agriculture. What have they done with genetic engineering? 2 fucking traits in only 4 crops. And billions of dollars spent. And what have they done? Nothing but reinforcing a chemical intensive agriculture when people are, we're creating, as you guys I'm sure well know,
Okay, so that was the major bit that, what have they done? 2 things. And to me, that bit from Kloppenberg really gets at that Kloppenberg, like what this shows is the stakes and what is lost when this process, this science process becomes commodified, right? When science and innovation is harnessed not for the general good of the public or society, whatever you want to throw in there, but for private enterprise and profit, which leads us to this long Marxist, so that's part of it. But here's the other bit about how all of that we previously talked about, the abstract Marxist BS, if you think it's that, or truth if you're an orthodox, whatever you want to call it. How does that relate to agriculture, more specifically and historically? So there's this thing in Marxist thought about an agrarian question. If you've ever heard of Karl Kautsky, he's the one who's famous for this. But this is a long debate. It's kind of boring, and it's also really messy. Like Marx calling peasants like a sack of potatoes. Major fumbles in Russia with tons of lives lost, basically because they didn't understand agriculture. Mao, it was also the same thing. Most of the peasants who were, the peasant famines, most of this was due to a misunderstanding of the relation between capitalism and agriculture. And there's these 2 thinkers, Mann and Dickinson, who in critical agrarian studies are quite famous and big in this. Where this comes from is cited a lot. Who have this line: capitalist development appears to stop at the farm gate, right? So this is the crux of the agrarian question. It's how does Marxist analyses of capitalism apply to agriculture? What are the implications? And generally, the commonly accepted thought here is that Marxist thought does not apply because farms aren't dependent on labor, and because there's all these obstacles that farming poses to capital. And these are things like the availability as land is fixed. You have to cannibalize another landowner to have it. It's spatially fixed, which obviously can't move around. That produces circulation issues. Production time is greater than labor time. The amount a crop spends growing is greater than the time it takes to plant it. This is that's probably up for debate. I'm sure Jeremy and Spencer could fight me on this, but this is the obstacle that is assumed by Marxist analyses of agriculture. Seasonality, labor controls, because of the extensive area agriculture covers, it's really difficult to surveil your workers. All of these things, and there's this, this fence, granddad's farm, keep out, blah 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 blah. Is there a hint of romanticism applied to like capitalism? Is this thing separate from agriculture? Is this thing separate from agriculture? Like, no. Because in actuality, the obstacles are not obstacles at all. The gate looks something like this. Keep gate closed, but obviously, it's serving no purpose. And this is really this really demonstrates the tendency to conflate farming or the specific laboring activities of the farmer with agriculture more broadly, when agriculture in fact involves much more than the practice of farming. In fact, like 13, the statistics, for example, that Kloppenberg brings in is 13% of total value of ag products comes from only 13% of total value of ag products comes from on-farm production processes, 32% come from commercial inputs, and then 55% are all post-farm processing. So So what does this quote mean? Because this is essentially what Kloppenberg's saying. There's this long debate in Marx. Capitalism isn't in agriculture. It stops at the gate. As we saw, the gate is less a gate than kind of just letting everybody in. The differentiation of functions off-farm provides capital with a way around obstacles to its penetration that does not necessitate exploitation of the farm producer in the sphere of circulation. In other words, yes, it's not direct in the same way that a factory wage labor is exploited by the capitalist factory owner, this type of direct exploitation, but there is still exploitation of the farm producer and of the farm enterprise more broadly by kind of going around that direct route. So what does this mean? It means that it effectively works around all those obstacles I listed to exploit the farmer through the appropriation of off-farm functions. And this gate was quite perfect for this presentation because, as you can see on it, it says, please keep gate shut to prevent wild plants from escaping, which makes, is relevant given the topic of this course. And Kloppenberg isn't just like pulling the stuff out of his ass. This is from an economist. Capital has replaced labor as the chief. What this chart shows is that capital has replaced labor as the chief input in agriculture, and agriculture itself then has become the most capital intensive sector in the economy. Doesn't show the second half of that, but you can see from 1870, labor 65%, capital 17%. 1976, you got labor at 16, you got capital at 62. Real estate stays about the same. The percentage of capital readily increases. And if we go to this chart place, we can see that this shift from away from labor towards capital took place through a series of capitalist appropriations. The inputs that were previously produced on the farm have been converted to off-farm inputs that now serve industrial or commercial inputs. Industrial or commercial interests. So you see here in, I can't remember which date, 1965 is the baseline. So that's what 100 means. And then its percentages greater and less. So again, you see farm labor steadily decreases, machinery, chemicals all increase, purchased inputs increase, non-purchased inputs decrease. And you might be saying, okay, Jacob, that's great. This is 1977. It's now 2022. Were you even like alive back then? The answer to that question is no, and hopefully you knew it. But I went to the ag censuses from 1969 to 2017, got the data myself. It's still broken down in the same way, same categories. And you can see steady increase. And this is interesting, but it's not as interesting as these charts, where you see so the top one is the total money spent, the total dollars spent on the particular expense category. So in 1969, for example, there is 871 million spent on seed. And then the percentage is the percent of total agricultural expenses, total farm expenses that were spent on that thing. And you can see that all of them increase drastically. And more importantly, not only do all of the various categories increase, but the overall amount of like the overall farm expenses also increases. And I need to get moving. And then the bottom shows the percentage increase from decade to decade. Sorry, they aren't round decades. I'm not in charge of the ag census, or they would be. Yeah, that's the other dynamic we have going on in the background. Average farm size increases, number of farmers decreases. And you can see on the bottom chart, again, steady increases. For our purposes, from 1969 to 2017, the percent increase in seed expenses was 2,300%, which is immense. So all of this is supporting data for this idea that the thread, the single dynamic that runs through 20th century agriculture is the appropriations of previously on-farm productive activities by industrialist or capitalist agriculture firms, so off-farm interests. Farm says that's complicated. The most significant change in agricultural production experienced under the impact of capitalist development is the displacement of production activities off farm and into circumstances in which fully developed capitalist relations of production can be imposed. If you take one thing away from me spouting things at you, take away this idea of appropriation.